Uh, Hi guys, welcome back. Wanted to record this video. Don't really have any notes or anything like that, just kind of a freehand discussion. The title of the video is Mercenary Misconceptions. And I just wanted to talk about the role of mercenaries in the early modern Renaissance and early modern period, um, or late medieval, depending on how you sort of look at it. I tend to look at Renaissance, early modern warfare as going back even into the 1450s. But anyway, that's not really relevant to the. That's sort of a side issue. So a lot of people online and in like wargaming, I think, are pretty familiar with, oh, they had these mercenary armies, they being early modern, or I'll just say Renaissance because it's shorter, Renaissance era kingdoms and nation state or nations, and empires had these mercenary armies. Um, and that's usually kind of contrasted, or traditionally has been contrasted with what we would think of as a modern state military. And the traditional narrative, even in academic history, has been the um, the the mercenary army, kind of derisively framed, was supplanted by the centralized state. Um, Now there is truth to that sort of transition that does happen, but um, the issue lies that it's usually framed as one is better, and it was this doing away with this outmoded, bad system. And like with most things in history, the truth is a little more complicated and a little not so simple, which is the same as being complicated. Anyway, um, so why? Let's just start from the beginning in the 15th century. So why mercenaries? Why does this become so prevalent? And if you're familiar with the Italian Wars, how that was, or even before the Italian Wars and the wars in Italy, the Condottieri, that are kind of these famous figures. Um, why were they so prevalent? Well, it's quite simple. In the feudal system, um, if a king, a monarch, had to go to war, he had to um, call up his noblemen, who then levied from the people under them and all the way down. Sounds great in theory, but if you're familiar with medieval history, which I'm sure many of you are, that are subscribed, and other viewers as well, uh, it's doesn't always work that way. A lot of these nobles don't necessarily want to have to go fight. They're not, and it's also in the medieval period. It's also very close knit family, essentially. Um, these monarchs and their nobility. So if there's a issue in the family, and king might not be able to get troops. So if someone has to go to war, well, and they can't get the men, well, I'll go hire mercenaries. Um, and of course, mercenaries aren't a new concept in military history. I mean, uh, they existed in the ancient world, in the I don't like to use the term Dark Ages, but I would say the early medieval period. We'll say the Varangian Guard. We covered in the Byzantine army book review. Byzantines used a lot of mercenaries in their later period, and so it's just something that's been there forever. I'm sure. Um, But back to the topic at hand, especially in the we'll focus in on the 15th century for this first section. Um, the monarchs need an army that's not necessarily, or they want one that's not necessarily tied to these nobles, because he can't depend on them. So uh, you'll go and hire professional soldiers, mercenaries, and quite often the mercenaries at this time, and for the couple centuries of the time period we're talking about, were better than whatever sort of noble levies um, the monarchs could get, especially in the 15th century. And you definitely see that with um, in Hungary, which is, if you watch the channel, that's something Central Europe is something I'm really interested in. And so under János Hunyadi and later Matthias Corvinus, the two really great leaders of sort of the heroic age of the Hungarian kingdom in the 1400s. Um, we'll start with Hunyadi. Hunyadi sees that um, he can't really depend on the nobility that are subordinate to him, so he goes and he gets mercenaries because they're just more consistent. He can call them up as long as they're paid. Now that's one of the that's the crux of the issue. But as long as they're paid, they're a full force of professional soldiers. Um, and later on, Matthias Corvinus does the same thing. He establishes the referred to as the Black Army of Hungary because of their black armor, plate armor, um, and does the same thing. Now, in both cases, both Hunyadi and Matthias, this upsets the nobles a lot because it's, well, okay, now he's taking power from us. He doesn't need us. He has this army. But they needed it to fight the Ottomans. I mean, you can't you can't go up against really strong rising at that time military power like the Ottoman Turks and not have good soldiers. So that's an issue. They need the good troops, and the noble feudal levies just don't really work that well. And so in the 15th century, that's kind of a brief. I can't talk about every area of Europe and every situation, but I think that case is sort of interesting because it shows the two different sides of it. Where okay, they need to hire these leaders need to hire the professional mercenaries, professional soldiers to fight, but then the nobility uh, isn't always cooperative. So kind of a complicated balancing act there. Um, Now, on the other hand, the Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman Empire has a uh, standing army pretty early on. There's the foundation, so there's the Janissaries, which are fairly well known, and there's they're called they have a Turkish name, but I'll just say the household cavalry, the royal cavalry regiments, basically, or imperial cavalry regiments. Um, and they have that. The exact creation of the Janissaries are kind of debated, but uh, by the by about the reign of Selim the First, so you're talking about the late 15th, early beginning of the 16th century. They're sort of the main, the Janissaries especially, are sort of the main infantry. Um, and then they also have the, uh, so let me back up for a moment. They have both a standing force, and they also have like a feudal levy system. And I've covered some of those details in earlier videos, so I'm not going to get bogged down into it. But the core of the army is a full-time professional army, and for the Ottomans, that works really great up until they get to about the mid to late 16th century. They stop conquering so much territory. There's not as much money coming in, no new resources, and so this big standing army becomes some expense. Um, Now, on the other hand, you have the Eastern Habsburgs. Now, the Spanish Habsburgs, the Spanish line does have a standing army. They have the tercios in Spain, very effective, and they're able to do that because of all the wealth they get from the New World. But the Eastern Habsburgs and in the Holy Roman Empire, um, not really as much. Um, there's really not that much of a standing army. Now, there's garrisons on the border with the Ottomans, and I've mentioned that. Again, that's another topic we've covered in other videos. But that's not really like a full. It's not like an operational army. That's a defensive army, good one. Don't get me wrong, but it's meant to stay on that militarized border and protect it. Um, it's not like the Ottoman army. That's when it's raised, it's ready to go, and it's gonna attack. Um, but the point here is for the Holy Roman Empire, the contracting system really worked well. And you can read about this in a book by David Parrott called The Business of War that covers this kind of topic in greater detail and with a lot better presentation than I'm doing. And he gets into how it was kind of a problem that okay, maybe they're not the most reliable soldiers, but they are generally pretty good. And these mercenaries in the Holy Roman Empire from the mid late 16th century. I didn't really talk about the lands next, but this kind of goes for them as well. That earlier part during the Italian Wars. But in the mid late 16th century and then into the 30 Years' War, it really works well that for the Holy Roman emperors because the state just has to pay these captains a lump sum essentially. They get the contract, and then the captains themselves are responsible for the weapons, the equipment, all that stuff. And so, and if they're an intelligent captain, they're going to get the best gear they can as possible. So, in a way, it really placed less burden on the emperors. And if you know anything about the Holy Roman emperors, especially in that in the roughly the from about 1550, 1500, mid 1500s to the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, there's money is always a problem, but it's a problem for all early modern Renaissance rulers, generally speaking. And so works well. There's no need to build all this military infrastructure, and we'll get to a kind of counter case to this in a minute with the Swedes. But there's no need to build all this military infrastructure, and they can raise the army when they have to go fight the Turks, and then it's disbanded at the end of it, and there's no need to keep paying these guys necessarily. And depending on your perspective, fortunately or unfortunately, there is always kind of other places for these guys to go fight. So, might not be needed with the Turks, but they might go fight in, talking the 16th century, might go fight with the Dutch for a little while, go, wherever there's a new sort of conflict zone, or go fight the French Wars of Religion, maybe. So it was a job back then, and there was always sort of work somewhere. but in terms of the political and the social issues in the Holy Roman Empire and in the Habsburg realms, it worked pretty well for them. Now, on the other hand, the usual like historical narrative, um, if you look at historians like Jeffrey Parker or some of these other authors that have studied what they call the military revolution, this period. Um, Sweden is kind of pointed to as this. Okay, they had a they had a militarized kind of society. They had a standing army. They had all these. Uh, they had this really effective um, military, and it's true they did. And the Swedes were able to um, put together. Were extremely powerful. Excuse me, up until the early 18th century. Um, but long term, it really came at a price for the Swedes because it's a part of the world where you have a low population already, comparatively speaking. There's only so many men to go around, and because of all that fighting, not only from the 30 Years' War, but all the Northern Wars, which is a really interesting topic that I'd like to study more in detail at some point, read more in detail at some point. Um, a lot of the men, because they were basically drafted into the standing army, were wiped out. And so I think I was reading recently, and it might have even been from Jeffrey Parker's book on the 17th century. It's called Crisis something. Anyway, just look up Jeffrey Parker Crisis. You'll find it. Really interesting book. Something like it was like there was like for every one Swedish man there was like 8 women or something like that. Don't quote me on the exact number, but a really a really severe um, imbalance resulted because all these men were drafted. So um, it's one of those things, is one better than the other? I mean, I think in history it's kind of sometimes those sorts of things aren't very useful, but I think if you look long term, where the Habsburgs always, the Eastern Habsburgs, I should say, were they always the wealthiest and the most, militarily powerful state, because they never fully turned this corner um, until the of having like a standing centralized army until like the 18th century. I mean, you could make a case that that they were always kind of a weaker power and not really the best compared to Sweden, but I mean Sweden's sort of dominance on the continent and as a great power is kind of short lived. It seems like after the Northern Wars they kind of they were spent and didn't really have much of an impact after that. Um, and in the Ottoman case, uh, just to make this, add another point of comparison, um, so they have the really kind of resource intensive standing army with the janissaries, the cavalry, the artillery. But for them, what really saves the Ottomans in the 17th century and allows them to sort of stabilize from some issues that they're having in that time period, they go to a mercenary contracting system, basically like the Habsburgs. And again, that's one of those things where in the traditional sort of narratives it says, "Oh, that was sort of the marked the decline of the Ottomans," and then they were routed. They were defeated at Vienna in 1683. Um, and there's certainly you can certainly understand why that case can be made, right? But um, from my reading of it, it looks like that really helped the Ottomans because again, like the Habsburgs, you're not having to pay these salaries year round, and the Ottomans do it a little differently. So, um, individual governors use their treasuries of their particular province to raise an army, and then when the Grand Vizier or whoever is put in command is needs an army, okay, the governors are basically drafted in and they bring their troops. And so again, it's one of those things. Well, okay, you can have the standing army, and there's a lot of advantages there, but you can do the mercenary contracting thing and have and it takes away some of the issues that you have with the standing army. So just I guess to wrap up, um, you know, is this sort of transition from mercenaries to standing militaries in the 18th century, was this sort of like a positivist, um, mark of historical progress? I think it sort of did, and I would say, in my opinion, because this is an opinion video, um, I don't really think so. I think these things are um, sort of done in their time for responding to the conditions of that time, and so for you could say from about the 15th to the mid 17th century, uh, having a mercenary army just made the most sense for a lot of different powers, or having sort of a mixed arrangement where you have mostly, standing troops, but mercenaries as well, etc. So that's sort of my take on this. And if you want to learn more, I recommend taking a look at that book by David Parrott, The Business of War. Um, it's a little dry. It's not like a traditional military history because he's looking at the sort of financial aspects of it and resource aspects of it, but it does give you an interesting sort of insight into this issue. And I would also recommend Peter Wilson's history of the 30 Years' War, which I've mentioned in earlier videos, but it's just really, really great. And he gets into a lot of the misconceptions that occurred about the 30 Years' War, and especially about like the mercenary armies aspect of it, that he describes in some detail about how a lot of those perceptions that still exist, because you see them a lot on the internet, didn't even really come from the actual history of the war or what actually happened. It came from 19th century German romantic nationalist literature about the war. So that's where you get these stories about 30 Years' War, mercenaries, massive atrocities, and granted, and Wilson says this as well, these things definitely happened, and there was a lot of death in certain regions, but it's really wasn't as total as people make it out to be, and a lot of the statistics on that are sort of iffy. But anyway, read that book. He does a better job of presenting that information. Um, and I can't really think of a good book about this for the Ottomans because there isn't one, and their sort of trajectory. There's a lot of article, because mostly what I've gotten is from a bunch of different academic articles, and I'm not going to sit here and like rattle those off. Um, but that information is out there. If you check on academia.edu, there's some stuff about that. And the book I've reviewed on the channel before, called Rhodes Murphy, or Ottoman Warfare 1500-1700 by Rhodes Murphy. That's kind of a brief, kind of too little short for my liking, but good account of the imperial army over those 2 centuries. So, hope you enjoyed the video. Um, Thanks for listening. Just as the last thing, excuse me. Again, I apologize. I haven't been doing a ton of hobby stuff. Um, I just don't have. Still need to get some paints, and I've been busy with work-related stuff, so haven't had a lot of hobby time. But I wanted to make this um, and just talk about this a little bit. And hope you all enjoyed it. And I'll talk to you in the next video.